Hey everybody, this is Maxine Taylor with another edition of Move Into the Magic. And some of you recognize my guest because Roberta Grimes has been a regular on Move Into the Magic. She is the most remarkable researcher. If you have not listened to my interviews with her or watched them on YouTube, you're going to want to do that. Roberta Grimes is mundanely an Austin-based business attorney. However, for decades, she has been researching and studying what happens to us when we cross over to the other side. And her books are absolutely enlightening and life-transforming. I call them the big three. She's written many, many more. But the big three, the first one is The Fun of Dying. And I'm telling you, after I read it, I could hardly wait. The Fun of Staying in Touch. And the book that we spent so much time talking about, Liberating Jesus. You are going to want to read these books. But today I've invited her to be my guest because she has a new book out. It's called My Thomas. And her titles are very, very interesting. And the title, My Thomas, leaves all kinds of questions. So, Roberta, first of all, welcome back to Move In.
I'm so glad to be with you, dear. It's good to see your face.
And it's just wonderful to be in your presence. Your book, My Thomas, your novel. Tell us about it, honey. Tell us.
Well, I thought it was a novel for the longest time. I just thought I was really brilliant. I wanted to be a novelist. You know, I was practicing law, but inside me was a novelist desperate to get out. And I got this idea late in the 1980s, this sort of brainstorm. My big hero has always been Thomas Jefferson. And most people don't have any idea that he lived the greatest love story in American history. And I say that because he had this beautiful, intense marriage that neatly spanned the Revolutionary War. And at 39, he was widowed, and he mourned his wife for the rest of his life. In his 80s, he said those 10 years of his marriage were 10 years of uncheckered happiness. Now, they spanned the Revolutionary War. He spent that whole decade fighting the revolution. So that, right there, it must have been a heck of a marriage. He called her the cherished companion of his life, and he lived most of his life after she died. So, and he burned all her papers. Nobody knew anything about her. So I was intrigued. The idea just came to me, and I did a year or so of research, and it was joyous, easy, fun. I found everything. It was just the best. Then I said, I bet I can start writing this now. And my prior experience with writing fiction had been that it's kind of painful. I sat down at my computer. I didn't even know what the first scene would be. The first scene unfolded, and then the whole rest of the novel unfolded in one take in Elizabethan English. Including, it's dense with cultural detail that I didn't realize I had picked up. It's just beautiful. It was published by Doubleday in 1993. I wanted to tone down some of the Elizabethan English. They loved it. They thought it was perfect. It got great reviews. The problem was that the acquiring editor suddenly left a Doubleday 2 months before it was to come out. So Doubleday at that point dropped the book. It didn't do anything to publicize the book, and the book died. So I was crushed. That was the masterwork of my life. And it went out of print. Fast forward to 2015. As I said when we talked about liberating Jesus, that whole adventure began because in February of 2015, my primary spirit guide, whom I had ignored my whole life, I knew he was there. I knew he was working with me, no idea who he was. He broke into a reading I was having through Suzanne Wilson with my family on this great big farm where they all come to play in the afterlife levels. We're having a wonderful time. And she said, your spirit guides want to talk to you. Turns out I have 11. Apparently I'm very hard to manage. That's an unusually large number. But then my primary guide stepped forward and said that, announced he was my primary guide and said, "You may call me Thomas." Immediately I said, "Thomas Jefferson." And he said that was right. So that floored me. And I was such a groupie because he's my big hero. And I couldn't see him, of course, but I could imagine he was rolling his eyes. This was why he didn't want me to know who he was. But he had broken in because he wanted me to write the book that I came into this lifetime having promised him I would write. And that's the only reason he guided a ditzy female for her whole life. Because when he was Thomas Jefferson, he had written a book about Jesus. Many people don't know just how much of a spiritual man he was and how much his feelings were consonant with what we say in Liberating Jesus. But he wanted me to write his book for the present day. And I think I had refused during our counseling sessions. "No way, Jose, am I writing about Jesus? You can put that away." So he basically, as someone said, bullied me into it. And I did write Liberating Jesus. And then he was a totally different guy. He had been all tense before, and now he was sort of relaxed and mellow. So in September, he remarked, when I was having a session with just to talk to him through Suzanne, he remarked that he had actually written my Thomas. Oh, this is really big news. You wrote, no wonder it's good. You wrote it. I didn't write it. But Thomas Jefferson was a very, very private man in life. His, quote, autobiography is nothing but his later public acts. He was very protective of his wife, especially. Why would he do this? Because my Thomas is a beautiful love story. It starts when they meet, and it goes right through her death, and it's just the most beautiful love story. And he would the Thomas Jefferson of history would never have written anything remotely like that. Now I know he had female help. Apparently, I have 3 female guides who specialize in fiction. So he didn't say he had written it. He said he had guided it, and he had made sure all the facts were right. This was big news. I dared to ask him if he would let me say that if we republished my Thomas, and he said, sure. So here he has approved the author's preface, which tells this story. But basically, now we know my Thomas is not a novel. My Thomas is a memoir, a very personal memoir written by Thomas Jefferson a couple of hundred years after he died, almost. So that's neat. Don't you think that's neat?
Oh, my word. Well, of course, to me, this is just marvelous. I'm going to ask questions that some people in our audience might have, because you and I take what you're saying as what is. So I'm trying to think how to phrase this in the way someone in the audience would. So in essence, Thomas Jefferson is your primary guide who made himself known to you, and he wrote the book, which means then, and here's the question part, did you channel Thomas?
What I channeled was the group that he led, and that's why it's so good. I'm not as smart as I thought I was. After my Thomas died because Doubleday wouldn't promote it, I decided I can do this. Well, look what I just did. I'm a brilliant whatever. So I researched the Winslows. Edward Winslow was a Mayflower passenger, and I lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts at the time, and I spent a lot of time researching his family in the early 1800s. I was going to write a terrific novel. I had it all set. And as with my Thomas, after I did the research, I sat down with my fingers on the keys. And I sat the whole morning with my fingers on the keys. And I did that for a month. I knew the same process had to happen again, and it didn't. That's one of in retrospect, I look back, I never thought I could channel, but in retrospect, I look back and say, how could I have thought I wrote that? I mean, it's so full. It reads like someone is actually living in the 1770s. It's full of really sort of little cultural details that are really neat about the people and about their surroundings. Now, I want to say to your listeners, I am a dry, dull researcher. dry as toast. Until I started channeling Liberating Jesus, I had no clue I had any psychic abilities. Turns out I'm a heck of a channel, but who knew that? It isn't just Liberating Jesus and My Thomas that I've channeled, but apparently every novel I've ever written after the first one has been channeled, and The Fun of Dying, The Fun of Staying in Touch were channeled. I now understand I can't do a blessed thing on my own, which is just reality. And I know that some people are saying, this is like claiming you were Cleopatra. I know. I was as surprised as anyone could be. He says that he and I go way back. We have lived 17 lifetimes together. I already knew I'm not part of my soul family is not my birth family in this case. I think only one person who is in my life right now, possibly two, I've had other lifetimes with. That's okay. I do know also, he said this, and I have now begun to remember the lifetime I had when he was Thomas Jefferson. He was an old man, and I was, I think, Richard Rush. I was a young protege, and we talked a great deal about this. Obviously, this whole idea that we're going to write Liberating Jesus, he and I, goes back a very long way. So why did he do My Thomas? That still was something I wondered about until he told me something else through Suzanne. He said that I was thinking I had written his book. And in the middle of it, Jesus jumped in and I channeled Jesus for 2 weeks. And the whole thing was kind of overwhelming to me. But he now tells us that Jesus decided in the Think of the past. Put yourself, if you can, in the hands of, in the mind of the Lord. He came to us 2,000 years ago, and he was God on earth. Literally, I'm pretty confident that's true. He wasn't just the Son of God. God walked the earth. Only time I've ever heard of that this could have happened. First, to figure out how giving us free will could possibly have screwed up so badly, because we need free will in order to grow spiritually. I mean, it's essential, but yet look at the mess we're making. This is 2,000 years ago. I imagine, you wonder what they think now. And he also taught us how to fix it, which is the teachings of Jesus. So the whole point of Jesus's life was the teachings. We already know from the afterlife evidence that most of what Christianity says about Jesus and his meaning and his message comes from St. Paul, who never knew Jesus and who basically packaged the teachings in totally unrelated first century Jewish beliefs. That's okay. I'm thrilled that he did it, or we wouldn't have the teachings at all. But so Jesus, that was Jesus's first attempt, and he had to watch it screw up. He tried a second time in the 1960s when he led the group. Thomas says he led the group that channeled A Course in Miracles. And the problem with A Course in Miracles is that if the teachings of Jesus were over the head of people 2,000 years ago, well, A Course in Miracles is over our head now. I mean, you can't just read it like a book. You got to do a study group. It's a process. I spent a year at it and got as far as the undoing of the ego. I can tell you, A Course in Miracles works beautifully, but it's heavy stuff. So he overshot. And so then he decided, after that turned out to be another overshot, he's going to do something really simple. He's going to tell us, just read my teachings. Take that Bible that you have and the red letters in it, many of which I did speak, and just follow the teachings. And I'm going to prove to you I know what I'm doing, because I'm also giving you all this information about how to reach the dead. For the first time in human history, we can figure out a lot about what actually happens at death. And I always wondered, why are they giving this information? Now I know at least one reason was so Jesus could say, okay, here's what you've learned independently. Here's what I said 2,000 years ago. You got to match, folks. Let's start living the teachings. And then we can bring the kingdom of God on earth. So Jesus was going to do this, and he wanted a new vessel, someone who had never channeled before, but he had to prove that person could channel. Thomas, bless his little heart, he had me on the way to writing his book anyway. I mean, my whole life has been directed toward writing Liberating Jesus. I didn't even know it. I mean, why else would I would I go to Smith, which is one of the classiest, certainly when I was going there in the 60s, it was a star school. I went there and I majored in early Christian history. I didn't know at the time why I was doing it. So much of what I've done, I didn't understand at the time, but he was co-piloting me in my head. So I was nominated and I was accepted, but they had to prove I could channel. So that's why my Thomas exists. This was a story that Thomas could help me research and could prove, therefore, that I could do research with the help of guides. And he also could lead the channeling, proving I could channel. And it turned out that the one psychic thing I could do is I could channel like the son of a gun. But that's why it exists. It's quite precious to me knowing that, I have to say.
I can certainly understand that. That is a remarkable story because you came from one background and ultimately stepped out of the box. In fact, there is no box.
Yes. I mean, this is how it feels. I've spent my life studying the afterlife. And that also, no coincidence, as soon as my Thomas was published in 1993, that got kicked into overdrive. I never wrote another word until I wrote The Fun of Dying. I was voracious then in my research. That was all Thomas making me do that and showing me how it would fit together and making it all work. When I discovered this past fall, when I discovered what had happened really and came to understand it, I had this very strange feeling. I've spent my whole life deliberately not psychic, studying dry evidence and trying to put it together. And I've gone from being a student of the afterlife evidence to being part of the afterlife evidence. I feel as if my whole life has been part of that, of the things that are being done now to help to elevate the consciousness of the planet. And the afterlife understanding that we're getting is a big part of that process. But I don't have any private life now. My life is part of that. And I've had to get used to that, I have to admit, because I used to be private. I'm not private now. And I accept that now. I mean, I'll tell you anything about my life. It doesn't belong to me anymore.
I am so glad that you shared the information on Liberating Jesus, because our interview on Liberating Jesus blew me away. I think it is the consummate book.
Bless you, dear. A lot of people love it, I have to say. I've heard from some this morning.
Well, now the sales of that book, my understanding from what you talked about, the sales of Liberating Jesus are just off the charts.
Yeah, I don't have current figures, but it's been astounding, in part because I'm not famous. I've never written a bestseller, and yet it's being treated by the chains as if it were written by, I don't know, name someone who was a major figure. They're all buying the book, which is, so it is in bookstores. And if someone's interested in reading Liberating Jesus, ask in your local bookstore, because they probably carry it. They can order it for you if they don't have it on the shelves. We heard early on that one complaint they had was that they couldn't keep it on the shelves, which to me is a good problem to have. The books would get bought as soon as they were shelved.
Oh, and tell us about Dubai.
Yeah, one of the things that's just begun to happen is that Liberating Jesus is being sold internationally. And among the first countries in which a big distributor has bought the book was United Arab Emirates. So we looked at each other with kind of amazement. We were very surprised. But on the other hand, Jesus came for all of us. And his words are just as true if written in Arabic or Chinese or any language as they are true if they're written in English.
And so here we are with your latest book. And actually, it's not your latest, as you said, it was written in 1993, but the updated version.
It's been out been in print, out of print for a very long time, for 20 years. So it's really like a new book. It's a new book to people.
Yes. So let's talk about Thomas. Now, you mentioned, of course, that Thomas Jefferson mourned his wife mourned her death for the rest of his life. And you mentioned that it's a love story. Can you share some of that with us and maybe mix it in with what he's written about the revolution?
Well, what's interesting about the novel is that it's a very good account of Jefferson's life during the Revolution. I mean, it reads like a movie because you couldn't have scripted it better as a movie. They met as young aristocrats in Virginia. She was a young widow. She was only 22. He was 27. And that was late for him. He wasn't married yet. We believe he had Asperger's syndrome, which I know very well because my husband and my son both have it. But he was high functioning, as are they. And so he just was shy and sort of awkward around women. But this young widow, whose name was Martha Wales Skelton. Now, Wales was her maiden name. She had married Bathurst Skelton. And when he died, he left her an independent heiress, really. And Thomas courted her, but it was very awkward. And it's I mean, the story he tells is charming about their courtship and about her reluctance to remarry. And of course, why would she want to remarry? She didn't need money. She had the problem, too, that at that time, women could not own their own property if they were married. They could control their property if they were single. But they couldn't if they were, part of their daughter. They were a daughter and had no independent assets, and they couldn't if they were married. So basically, she's saying to him, "Why would I get married? I don't want to get married." He's pretty frustrated. Then her little 3-year-old son dies of what they called malignant encephalitis, which probably was, could have been. I have no idea, really, but just a quick onset illness that killed him. At that point, she doesn't have her son. She has fallen in love with Thomas, and so at that point, she consents to get married. And right from the beginning, it surprises her how intense their friendship is, because this isn't necessarily usual. I mean, she starts this process saying, doesn't matter who you marry. I mean, they're just all men. And she falls so in love with this particular man, with the things about him that were a little bit awkward, young, shy, and the fact that he's so brilliant. He's even then, starting the career which we know took him to the highest heights. He was the first Secretary of State, the second Vice President, and the third President of the United States. He sort of did it all. And at 33 years old, he left her long enough to go to Philadelphia, be part of the process, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, and he wrote it, when he wrote it, and you see the first version of it, you see that even that early, he was an abolitionist. He hated slavery. And the problem was he inherited slaves, and not long after, it was illegal to free them. And if you did that anyway, anybody else could just enslave them again. So he thought they were better off where he could protect them than if he sort of let anybody do what they wanted with them, with these people that he cared about. When he married, he inherited, or she did, because somehow he arranged for her to be able to control her property. Except that was, I think, a fiction between them. 6 of the young slaves they inherited were half siblings. Martha was Patty. Everybody who was female in early Virginia was named Martha. Martha, Mary, or Anne. And if your name was Martha, you were always called either Patty or Patsy. So she was Patty. Their daughter Martha was Patsy. And Martha Washington was also Patsy. You were one. I don't know why. I've never seen an explanation, but that's how it was. So Patty inherited quite a few slaves when her father died, because he only had girls. She had 2 sisters. As a result, they got to inherit what he had owned. If they even had one brother, he would have inherited it all. That's how the screwy laws were back then. She seems to have started out as, someone who's oblivious. They inherited slavery. There are so many things in our culture, which we could talk about on another day, which when people look back in 200 years, they'll be appalled that we allowed them to continue, that we lived with them, appalled. And we look back now on slavery as a pure evil and blame the people who held slaves, but they were stuck with it. They didn't create slavery. They came to hate it. And the only thing they could do, though, because they couldn't legally free their slaves, was to just try to protect them and take care of them. And his surviving writings, he kept all kinds of records of things. He kept account books of what he spent and what he owed, and who he was dealing with. So we know that his slaves routinely worked 5 days a week and had 2 days off, which seems to us to be good. They had their own homes. They had their own private gardens behind their homes, and there they would raise chickens, eggs, vegetables. And there are many accounts in his account book where he notes how much money he owes to this or that slave because they had just sold a chicken or eggs to the great house. So this is hardly what we think of as slavery. It became apparently a much less benign institution in the 1900s, but they still hated it. It's right there in his writings. And when he wrote the Declaration, I don't know how we got on slavery. I think that's an important undertone in this book, though, because Martha lived under a very unpleasant stepmother. Her mother died in childbirth. And the only real mother she seems to have had was Betty Hemmings, who was the mother, the mistress of her father, and the mother of all of the 6 Hemmings children.
Okay, I'm getting lost in the lineage part here.
There is a chart in the front part of my Thomas, which says who all the people are, because you're right, there are too many people.
And they're all
can't write a novel that's really a memoir and leave out key people, so he didn't.
Well, and also, as you said, you've got the same names repeated through the lineage. But I would love to pursue, Sally Hemings. All right. In the book, you say that Jefferson was not the father of Sally Hemings' children. Okay, number one, who is Sally Hemings? And if he wasn't the father, who was?
When Thomas, the youngest of the 6 3/4 white children that Betty Hemings had with Martha's father, was Sally. She was a tiny child at the time, and very much younger than they were. And she was taken as a mistress by a member of his family when the member of his family was briefly without a wife. And actually not so briefly, was basically they had a love affair. And there's a lot of evidence of that in the record. I mean, he was reported to spend a lot of time in the quarters, dancing with the Negroes, sneaking out of Sally's cabin early in the morning. Thomas seems not to have cared or meddled because this was consensual. Sally wanted it as much as he did. And if anybody wants to do the research honestly, you can figure out who the father was. It's very clear. And I didn't care about this story because it happened much later than Martha's life when I was writing the novel, but I became curious about it afterwards and I did the research. So I've known for 20 years that it was someone else. Why do people think it was Thomas? Because he was the one who was famous, and because during his political career, he turned down a very disreputable fellow named Callender for the post office, being postmaster of Richmond, because the guy was basically a crook. And so this fellow went on a rampage against Jefferson, and one of the several things he threw at Jefferson was that he was the father of all these children, who, of course, their mother being 1/4 black, these children were 1/8 black. There were a lot of white slaves at Monticello, but they weren't his kids. None of them were. And as I say, you can see so much circumstantial evidence, A, that he wasn't the father, and B, who the father was, that I don't think it's even an open question. But as you can imagine, when I had access to the guy, that was my first question. He would not talk about it. He would not talk about it. I was getting it from historian friends. Well, if you're really talking to him, find out the answer to this. This is the biggest question. He wouldn't talk about it. And in fact, he doesn't really want to talk about that lifetime. We think of it as like a major lifetime. He says it's not even the most important lifetime he's lived, or I have lived, believe it or not. We don't remember anything about our prior lives while we're here, and so I'm just oblivious too. But he was very disappointed in things that happened during his presidency, especially, and he says it imbalanced him so much that he had to have an extra, it was supposed to be his last lifetime on earth. He had to have one more lifetime where he could kind of get himself back into balance in order to be able to stop incarnating. That's how bad that lifetime was to him. So the fact that we're interested in it, and I'm kind of, a groupie about it, it disgusts him. It's like, forget about it. But finally, one day, he did admit that he was not the father. And he gave us the best possible reason why. This is an 18th century gentleman who when he wrote the Declaration, he had all the signers pledge their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. And he was a man who considered honor to be the most important possession that you have. And his reason for not sleeping ever with Sally Hemings was that she was a slave. She was his property. She could not have consented. If she can't consent, so the very reason people think, of course, he did it, is the reason he never would have, because she didn't have the power to say no.
Oh.
And he doesn't want me to talk about who the person was who was the actual father, but he was a Jefferson, and anyone who does a little bit of research can easily figure it out.
Fabulous.
But it does change your whole view of the man, right? To know that he didn't do that, and to know that there were reasons why he wasn't able to end slavery, which is something else people say he should have done. We have to remember, people live history going forward. They don't live it looking back. They don't know what is going to be cared about later. I'll tell you personally, when I try to understand what in this culture will people be most appalled about, there are a number of things: the condition of our prisons and how many people we imprison for even trivial offenses in a horrible way, the way that we have treated the freed slaves, which was something he tried powerfully to prevent exactly what happened, and that we've had 150 years of horrible treatment of people who happen to be descended from slaves or have a darker skin. We will be excoriated for that. We think we're virtuous. We're not. We have done terrible things to the Black people in this country. I think one of the things that, and I know people are going to think this is controversial, when we study the afterlife, one of the things we learn is true is that anybody who has been a fetus and died in utero grows up there. And which means miscarried and aborted fetuses grow up there, which means all those abortions people are having and thinking they're getting rid of something, they're not, because when they get there, there'll be a beautiful young person who will call them mom and will love them. Knowing that, how can we still condone abortion? How can we do it? I mean, it's handy. Yes, it's handy. And if indeed they were not people, who cares if it's just tissue? But it turns out, for the afterlife evidence shows that it is not just tissue. And within about 10 or 20 years, we're going to have very good electronic communication with the afterlife. So the people who are judging us in 50 or 100 or 150 years are going to be judging us much more from the perspective of the people we now think are dead. And those people are horrified at the way we even do partial birth abortion. You pull the feet out and you kill the baby, for Pete's sake. Anyway, that's just me. I mean, I don't even think about abortion except when I stop to think about how will the future judge us? I realize harshly for some of the reasons that I've given you, but I think one of the things that is going to most upset them is how many babies we've killed before they were born, because they are people and they will grow up in the afterlife. And Jesus spends a lot of time in those villages where their children are growing up. It doesn't take them long to grow up, but they do grow up.
This is a very interesting concept that I'm hearing for the first time, because what I had learned, or what I had been told, was that if a fetus is aborted, then that fetus has the opportunity to return, to reincarnate.
Oh, sure they do. Yes. But if they were on a planned life and they were miscarried in any way, if that pregnancy ends, they are I think of it as shrinkage, but that's not what it is. There's a process that we go through when we decide to enter an earth life, which requires that we put away most of our mind, most of our memories are packed away, and we must then come here and live our lives, and then when we go back, we have access to our memories. And the evidence is very strong that most of the people who have been miscarried or aborted don't immediately enter another fetus. They go back, they grow bigger, and within 2 or 3 years, they might come back. They might decide, okay, here's another place I can learn the same lessons or do the same work, often in the same family. There's a lot of evidence that people who die as fetuses or young children will reincarnate later in the same family.
Mm-hmm.
But they are people, and they do go to the afterlife levels where they are treated like royalty. And many of them do stay long enough to watch over their mothers' lives and then greet their mothers when they come.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So this brings us to where you're at now. And you are a prolific writer. What have you got on the agenda coming up? Because we're going to be talking about it on my show.
Well, my next novel, which probably I expect is coming out in the spring, is the first in a series of 7. I say all of this is channeled. I mean, what it is it's set in the 1500s on an obscure island in the South Atlantic, and it's about it's like a young adult story about people living barbarically, shipwreck victims making a barbaric culture, and a 12-year-old girl deciding to change it and beginning to succeed. And I found it harrowing to write because it's really brutal, but it was a challenge, and it's the first of 7. And so that's in the spring, a year, probably early 2017. I always knew it would be 2017. I didn't know what the book would be about. The third book in the Fun trilogy is The Fun of Growing Forever. I thought it would be more about details of the afterlife. People like to hear about that, but now I understand it's going to be about how to use the teachings of Jesus and other great teachings to make your life use them in normal 21st century life without having to join a monastery or learn to do yoga or anything. How do we use those teachings to grow as we're supposed to grow in this lifetime?
Wow.
Do it. And there are tricks to doing it too. I'll give you all the tricks I know.
Well, that is something to look forward to. I can't wait to interview you.
We'll have fun with that one.
Can't wait to write it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to I need to start writing it certainly by this summer, and so I'm trying to get my plate clear to do that.
Now, you have evolved so much in such a short period of time when you think about it, because when we first met on the internet, you had said, "Oh no, I am not a channel." I
know.
Like last year, I think, and I said, "Okay, Roberta," because I have my own opinions about everybody I interview. This is not my show; it's your show, and I invite guests who I just think are fascinating and who I would want to be friends with. Which is why I'm friends with so many people, because when I interview them, we become friends. And so you were very humble, and you said, "No, I use a medium. I am not a medium." And I thought, all right, so.
I was so clueless, wasn't I?
Well,
it was really.
It's an evolution. It's a spiritual awakening is what it is. And so now that you have, as it were, stepped out of the channeling closet and you are expressing more of the truth that you're seeing, everybody, of course, is interested in knowing more about their spirit guides. They don't have the open channel that you have, perhaps. And maybe they do, because I've met many people who are mediums and a couple who are well done. I mean, there's some.
Yeah.
So, if people want to know their spirit guides, how do they start? Help them.
Well, the way I met Thomas was through a very good spiritual medium, Suzanne Wilson. I know she has helped other people too. She has a course, which isn't very expensive, in meeting and learning to work with our primary guides and our other guides. And I strongly recommend that. Suzanne Wilson, I think it's carefreemedium.com. She lives in Carefree, Arizona, and she is carefree, so it's a good name. But she's terrific. For people to get in touch with people they love who happen to be in spirit, or to get to know your guides. And I recommend it because Thomas was doing a very good job of guiding me when I didn't know him. And he would never have told me who he was during this lifetime if I had submitted and written Liberating Jesus as I was supposed to do. But your guide is really almost part of you. The parts of Liberating Jesus that he channeled it was almost like I was just really smart, but I felt like I was doing the writing. That wasn't true with the parts that came from Jesus. So I recommend it to everybody now. I feel stupid that I waited so long to try to understand and know and love my guides.
Well, I don't think it's a question of stupidity.
Yeah.
It was your journey. I mean,
you're really right. You're right. We all, if it had happened sooner, it would have been a big distraction. You're right.
Now, of course, I know about the marvelous conference that you put on. I want to say every year. I really don't know how often you've done it, how long you've been doing it. But please share with everybody the conference that we talked about in one of our interviews that was life transforming. One of my dear friends went to it, our mutual friend, and she just thought it was the most magnificent experience she'd had.
Well, we did it for a couple of years, in 2014 and 2015, and it was, as you say, it was just a love fest, and we had some terrific presenters there. And after we did that, we planned to do one in September of 2016, and then we began to hear from our guidance. And our guides told us they don't want us doing another conference where 400 people show up. They want us to take it onto the internet and to do what amounts to a university on the internet where people can come whenever and learn from the same people and learn really much more. It's a way to reach out to more people. So we are in the process of working on that now.
Oh, that is wonderful. And Roberta, if there's anything I can do to help.
Oh, thank you, dear.
Ask. The thing that I thought was so magnificent about your conference, although I was not able to attend, but just hearing from you and our beautiful mutual friend, Linda, you had speakers there who shared their experiences, their research, and provided such a safe place to fall, so to speak. Mm-hmm. We have some time left. Would you share some of the information, perhaps, or some of the names of the speakers? Because I think our audience might like to contact some of them as well as you. And by the way, let me give your contact information out. I failed to do that earlier because we jumped right in, of course. Surprise. For those of you who'd like to get in touch with Roberta Grimes, all you have to do is go to her website, robertagrimes.com. Easy enough. Okay, honey, tell us. We've got some time for you to brag about yourself.
Well, I'd like to sort of finish two things we started to talk about, which I think are important.
Please.
And the first is about Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves till the day he died. Why did he do that? Well, there's a process there, and you can see it in his writings, especially during the period of his marriage. He was an ardent abolitionist. He was going to retire in 1781. and work on how to free all the slaves. He thought it had to be done correctly, and the way he was looking at doing it was educating a couple of generations of children and putting them on a separate continent internally, sort of Indiana and 2 other states or something. That would be a country where they would be able to live without being molested by white people. And then he was talking about importing people who've never owned slaves. He liked Germans because he met some during the Revolution he really liked. And, maybe do a checkerboard of farms so that they live close together, and just experimenting to see how we could fix it without doing what he thought would be disastrous, which was just freeing a few slaves into a stronger white culture, which would, treat them horribly forever. He said slavery brutalizes the masters as much as the slaves. And he and Martha were working on it. He was going to retire. He did retire in 1781 to his family, his farm, and his books. And that was what he was going to work on. And he would have succeeded. I'm confident by early 1800s, he would have succeeded in doing a proper abolition, which would not have required the Civil War. And therefore, we would all, and people would have been freed in a way which would have empowered them. And then, as he said it, they'll come together by natural process as all other peoples come together. That was what he wanted. Didn't succeed because Martha died. When she died, you can see it in his writings. So much, he was a broken man, really, in many ways, for the rest of his life. And one of the things that he felt he couldn't do was force emancipation. He couldn't get enough people interested in it ever for him to think it would have a chance of succeeding. And he tried that for the rest of his life. And because he was a wealthy man and a former president, and because it was the custom for people to, at that period, to stop at whatever plantation happened to be around to spend the night. After his presidency, Monticello was an unpaid hotel, and he would not slight the people who came. He didn't charge them anything. He gave them good food. He made sure their horses are well cared for. And he basically, that largely impoverished him, running that unpaid hotel. But he was, again, honor came before all. He was not going to tell people, look, you're taking advantage of me, and they did. So by the time he died, we still had no emancipation, so he still owned his slaves. He did by will free some that he felt were well educated enough, but the others he thought his family could still care for better, and that's why he did not free them. Her death changed the course of American history in a number of ways. He would not have again served in public office, and we would remember him for the Declaration and for the Great Emancipation. It'd be very different if she had lived.
Wow.
But what was the other thing I wanted to say? Oh, I also do podcasting, and I interview a lot of the same people that we had at the conference, so you can get a real flavor of who they are. I mean, people like R. Craig Hogan, who is working on the soul phone and making progress. Gary Schwartz is doing the same thing and making great progress around the possibility of texting with the dead using light photons. There are many people like that. Suzanne Wilson was there. Who else was there that you might love? At the previous conference, the Zamets were there. And now Victor and Wendy Zamet, who are people living in Sydney, he's an attorney, and he has for 30 years been doing this work virtually alone. And he has been in everybody's face. Don't ever get on the wrong side of Victor Zamet. And one of the things they've done, of course, is to post a $1 million prize for the first person who can prove that everything that is in their book, A Lawyer Presents the Evidence for the Afterlife, prove that each of those things is either faked or wrong. Nobody has yet, in 15 years, been able to prove that the truth is not the truth, which is kind of reassuring. But they are stars, and whenever we can have them, it's wonderful. And they'll be part of this process to do the university. just whoever the people are who are serious researchers. We had Michael Tim one year. I think he's the greatest living afterlife researcher. He's now in his 80s. Stafford Betty is in that same field. He's still a professor in California and does wonderful cutting edge afterlife research. We had Sonia Rinaldi year before last. She is someone no one's heard of, and everybody should have heard of because she's so far ahead in her development of the soul phone. She started working on it a number of years earlier, and the Brazilian station, she lives in Brazil, is at the point where people are routinely, sometimes hundreds of them a day, communicating directly with and hearing the voices of their dead children. That's one of her main causes, is to help people get over their grief by actually talking in real time with their dead loved ones. She's also developing methods, and this is already in beta, by which people in comas can communicate with their caretakers, because they're still perfectly conscious. It's just the body's not working, and usually they're not even in the body most of the time, but they're in the room or nearby, and they can let the caretakers know how they feel about things. That's another great service. She had worked hard to establish the Brazilian station, which is, and the word station is what the dead use. All this research is done by dead people. People who are here and helping them are just like lab assistants. That's true of even the most illustrious ones. They're taking orders. And the real problem is that these people not in bodies don't really think about money, because you don't need money where they are. So they will propose electronic designs that are impossible for people without, who are on a shoestring budget to put together. And they keep saying, make it simple and we'll put it together. So the only thing that this research needs and development of the North American station needs is the fertilizer of funds. When someone with money decides it's important we develop a way to talk in real time with the dead, we'll be doing it within 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Because it's already being done in Portuguese. And so the people working with Sonia were asked, why on earth can't you just bring through English? And they said, no, you need to establish the North American station. We are the Brazilian station. And while there's no language where we are, the people who gravitate to us here are people who speak Portuguese.
This is
so we got to do it.
So thrilling. And I know that there are people here who are unsung heroes who are doing that. I know someone who's doing it privately on her own.
A lot of people are doing recording now. The sort of ghost hunters who go into haunted houses, that's not very effective. What these people are doing is establishing their own stations with a constant sort of group of people on the other side who are working with them. And the more they do it, the better the connection becomes. The dead are very careful who they work with. If they think you're going to lose interest real soon, they won't bother, because it's a lot of work for them to make this work. But we have had good communications with the dead electronically for more than 30 years. That was when the Wright brothers took off. The only reason we don't have it now still is that the people who should be helping us, the scientists, and I think also people involved in religions, not only will not help, but they're afraid that maybe we'll manage to do it even without their help. They don't want this information to come out. I just read this morning that a cure for cancer developed in Houston has finally been approved by the FDA over strong objections from the cancer industry. Mm-hmm. Because they have a good gig going, and if it's easy to cure cancer, they're out of a job. Well, we have the same problem with scientists in general now, because once everybody believes that the afterlife is real and that their loved ones are fine. So scientists have been basically going down the wrong trail for so long. They'll be hard pressed to grapple back. So they're all hoping that this breakthrough, which many of them know is coming, this breakthrough will happen after their careers are over. Just postpone it a little longer. Let me have my career. And the same is true with religions. Once there's good communication, and I have been an ardent Christian my whole life long, once there's good communication, people will be telling us, God doesn't judge us. You know, you don't have to be a Christian to get into heaven. All that matters is that you learn to love and forgive perfectly. There's no Satan. There's no fiery hell. This and this and this. They'll tell them all that stuff is wrong. So if you think churches are emptying now, just wait until they're getting the truth from the dead. And I don't want them to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because while the afterlife evidence says that there isn't a religion that understands what's going on, and there isn't a one of them, it also affirms that the teachings of Jesus are exactly right. And he's just reaffirmed them in Liberating Jesus.
And you are going to want to read this book if you don't have a copy of it. Roberta Grimes, thank you so much once again for being my guest today. We will have many more shows.
Yes.
And so I leave everybody with the reminder that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Join me again next time when once again I have another incredible guest. Till then, looking forward to next time.